We're live.
Hello.
Hello. Welcome everyone to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers.
I'm Olivia Candosia.
Pouring some tea. And I'm a licensed therapist. And Olivia is an intern therapist, but this is not therapy for very, very many reasons. I'll be right there. What this is, I'm being loud. I don't know how.
No, you.
I'm like the same distance from the mic, but because I'm off camera, I feel like I need to shout. What this is an open conversation, like any other conversation. Olivia and I are here. We're going to be talking about whatever we're talking about with each other, keeping in mind to the best of our ability that, this is a public thing where we are doing this expressly in order to be helpful to you all. So we're making our best guesses about who you are and what you might be interested in and what might be helpful or relevant to you and how you're interpreting things and what you'd like to know. For those of you who are willing and able to participate in the chat, writing comments in the chat, we appreciate that because it gives us more information to be able to make our guesses about who you are and what you're interested in. Sometimes so much information that everyone would say it's absurd that I refer to it as a guess, even though to me, in an effort to be precise, it's still a guess, just a guess with a lot more information. No, it'll pop up above that. If it becomes an issue, we can.
Great.
Or you can move it now. I guess I don't know.
I don't know.
It's not that big a deal.
That was really good.
Yeah, we're going to be talking about whatever we're talking about. Please don't worry about like staying on topic or trying not to interrupt us or anything like that. If there's something you want to say, if there's questions, that's great. We'll do questions and answers. But also, like any conversation, doesn't have to follow a particular structure. What you say, we're aware of it. We read it, and it impacts what we do next. And what we're saying, you're aware of it. What you're watching and listening, it impacts what you do next. We do try to read out the comments because we're streaming on 3 different sites simultaneously, and you'll only see comments from other people who are entering, writing things in the chat from that site. So we read them out for people on the other 2 platforms to be able to know what's going on. We work for a private therapy practice called Effective Artistry. Our office is in Northbrook, Illinois. We do individual, couples, family, and group therapy with individuals in the state of Illinois. We also work with a couple of executive functioning coaches who can work with people all over the world via the internet. Yeah, that sounds like about
That sounds
right.
great.
That sounds like All right. Well, here we are. I'm saying this partly to help myself remember, and for you, and for anybody who is interested, that I have a 2:30 session.
Yes.
So I need to make sure that we wrap up by 1:20, 1:25-ish, which probably means I will actually wrap up at like 2:35. Did I just say 1:20? I meant 2:20, 2:30. Or 2:20, 2:20.
I was like, you usually don't give yourself that much time, like a whole hour.
Yeah. I usually give myself about -7 minutes before the scheduled start of the session to wrap up the thing I started before. And then I run that session long because I started it late, and then that makes the next one run long because I started that next one late. And it's a terrific cycle that's never caused me problems. Anyway, how you doing?
I'm okay. I was just thinking this morning, I was trying to turn my sink on, but they turned off the water.
Oh.
And they've been doing that the past few mornings during the week, and I have my mornings pretty available. And it has been so frustrating because I have all these chores I want to do in the morning, like my laundry and cleaning dishes and flushing my toilet, and I can't do them. And it's been getting in my brain's schedule of like what I want to do and then having to reroute.
That is very interesting for so many reasons. Let's talk about it. Partly because, some of it's related to what you and I were discussing before we went on the air, talking about people having clarity on what they want and whatever. That you're saying here that like, oh, you're so clear on what you want that when something goes differently, then it's like extra work to reroute what you want. My initial reaction is they're not giving you notice of when they're turning off the water.
And I texted both people like, hey, let me know when the water's working.
Both people.
There's like the landlord and then there's like the guy who actually works on the stuff.
All right. I often do things that probably to any interested observers give very clear hints as to my personal political beliefs and stuff, but pretty sure that's illegal.
fantastic.
To just turn off your water without no notice. I could be. I mean, like not in an
Yeah.
emergency situation, I guess, but like as a issue of pre-planned regular maintenance to like
Right.
deprive you of water with no notice. It's possible that they're putting a notice somewhere that you're not seeing it or whatever, but whether it's legal or not, and if it is, it shouldn't be.
Right.
Definitely seems worth saying, like, hey guys,
Yeah.
like this is causing problems for me.
I might send an email because text ain't getting anything.
Yeah, because whatever your, like they're literally not responding. See, that to me just fits in with it's technically illegal when they don't want to put anything in writing about acknowledging that they did it. But I can't say that for sure. This is just, I have my thoughts about things.
Yeah.
But yes, it's interesting, and we can talk about your specific experience of it. But there's nothing like uncommon about your psychology or your experience that makes this disruptive for you, where other people would be like, "No, I don't have water in the morning." Like,
right.
All of a sudden, like,
I was getting grumpy. I was getting real grumpy.
I would be grumpy if I unexpectedly didn't have water.
And I tried to like have a sense of humor about it first, like, okay, and then I was like, wait a minute, water's everything. Like,
yeah, I mean,
and then it wasn't so funny anymore.
We build lives. I don't want to phrase it. I want to say it differently, but that's the better way to say it, I think, for this format. What I want to say is like we are shaped by our experiences and everything about us and how we're constructed. But we build lives that fit for the contexts that we know.
Yeah.
And the context that we expect to continue. So do people all over the world currently survive without indoor plumbing? Yes. Have humans throughout history survived without? Yes. That doesn't make it strange for someone who has had indoor plumbing this whole time and has every reason to expect that it will continue to be like, what the hell, and be thrown off.
You remember when I was talking about like wanting to get immersive into the books I'm reading by eating the food that the books mentioned, and you had said like, that's not really immersive to me. That's actually reminding me that I'm not with the book or whatever.
Yeah.
I would never, when reading a little book about like Little House on the Prairie, want to go sit outside in the cold or not have plumbing for a week. That is when I would.
Yeah, how strange. Everybody else wants to have uncomfortable and unpleasant and difficult experiences just for the fun of it. Everybody else is like, well, it's warm inside, but I want to go sit outside in the cold just because I'm reading a book about people who don't have indoor heating.
But I will heat up a nice loaf of bread when they're talking about eating bread.
Good.
And that makes sense.
Well, there's a pattern here of you eat the things they're talking about eating, which is cool. And again, doesn't mean it's not immersive. I don't remember if that was on the stream or not.
It wasn't on the stream, no.
But you and I were just using immersive to describe different things.
Yes.
That word to describe different things.
Was it?
But yeah, no, that sucks that your water has been unexpectedly unavailable to you in the morning. That sucks.
That's just the first thing I was thinking.
Yeah, I would think about that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, So, I don't know. I have many thoughts about how to just turn this into a general conversation. And then I'm like, well, is it good to go that way? Or should we just be like, and what else are you thinking about? And
go general. I do for the folks.
The history of our species is a history of solving problems, by which I mean like things that cause pain and difficulty and discomfort. We try to address those things, right? And all living things do that. You need water, you try to get water. You need food, you try to get food, whatever, right? Humans just have been particularly successful at certain versions of this, and broadly what I'm talking about, we can just call it innovation, that we come up with ideas about something that would allow us to resolve some particular problem in a better way, either in terms of efficiency, like we get more return on smaller investment, or in terms of predictability and sustainability, that like, well, existing solutions work, but we never know when we're going to have them. And this one, now we have a solution that there's different improvements. But yes, the history of our species has been making our lives more and more and more comfortable and convenient. I mean, those are words that we're using to describe just creating things, implementing things, both physical things, but also like cognitive frameworks and understandings and routines and things that generally make it so that you have less to worry about, right?
Mm-hmm.
And what that does is it doesn't make you less worried. It just shifts what you're worried about.
Mm-hmm.
To me, this is one of the more helpful ways to talk about the concept of privilege, is that it's not that you're like, if you have privilege, you now are never sad or scared or worried or stressed, or, it's that we have this Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like if you are underwater, the only thing that you can worry about is getting access to air. When you have access to air, then you can worry about like having food to eat and water to drink. And it's only as these like, as each most urgent and pressing thing is addressed, that doesn't stop us from thinking about like, oh, now there's this thing that's a problem. We just move up this, he called it a hierarchy, right? And this is like deeply entwined with cognition, intellect, psychology, all this stuff, right? That for a person to have an experience, for a person to have awareness of feeling depressed requires that they have resources free and available to spend on being aware of their own experience. It is not to say by any means that whatever the state of being depressed is something that people who are starving don't experience. But it is to say that when you're starving, you're not paying attention to like, how are my emotions right now? Is this how I want to be feeling?
Mm-hmm.
And it's all just, as I say these things, I think about how people could interpret them. And this is also not to say that being depressed means that your life's pretty good and stop whining about stuff, because that's not the case either. But just pointing out that what we're talking about, especially in the world of therapy and executive function, all these things that people are generally coming here for these conversations. We're talking about things that, while these things can be and are problems for anyone and everyone, in order to be able to identify them as problems in this way, to think of your own psychological state and the processes that underlie it, et cetera, that generally speaking, you have to have resources spare to do that, which means that you are not like worried about freezing to death or starving to death.
It's like we were talking about reality TV shows, which is why they're so entertaining, because they starve them or put them under really stressful situations.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I hadn't thought about it that way, because in those cases, there's so much communicating that a person isn't actually in danger of dying, right? Like, as one of those people on the show, you would theoretically be aware that like you're not going to die. Like if it actually came to like, I am going to starve to death, no, they're going to give you some food and you're going to be pulled off the show,
right.
Whatever, So that would be a very strange, it's almost like a inverse version of catharsis, where like catharsis is about like feeling emotions in response to something that doesn't actually impact your life. This is stuff that's actually impacting your experience day to day, but you know that it's not actually a threat to like do the things that you would typically associate, like being that hungry and undernourished, you would associate with concerns of starvation, and that's not there. So then you're sitting around talking about like interpersonal dynamics, which is not something that people typically do when they're starving. I hadn't thought about it through that lens. That does, I don't want to watch them any more than I did before, but it does make the concept more interesting to me.
I'm telling you, that's why I love Survivor, Brandon.
To take people who would,
I love seeing like how people initially come in and they're fully fed and like functioning pretty well, and then when they start to lose that and they're like, I'm usually not like this, and just the way they start to think, or they like start to get paranoid, or I don't know, it's very interesting to me.
That makes me think of The Real World, which I don't actually know this is true, but I believe that The Real World was the first like reality show, and the slogan or whatever for it was like, what happens when people start being real or whatever. because you said what happens when these people come in and they're well fed and they're functioning well, and then
Mhm.
this stuff happens. And the interesting thing is, from our perspective, from my perspective, that all those other things they're doing is still functioning well,
Sure.
right? Like that emotional outburst, like that I am yelling in a way that I
Yeah.
don't normally
Yeah.
yell, is still functioning well, because it's just that's how you function in response to a different set of circumstances. Sure. But the fact that they and we all think of it as like, oh
Yeah.
man, like you're really on a downward spiral here, because that's kind of what I was trying to get at the beginning here, is eventually in my long winding way, is that because we get used to things being a certain way, then when things are less pleasant, or we move down that hierarchy of needs, right, then there's a different experience of it.
Like me not having water.
Yeah. That like, if your life, day, world, whatever, right, well, we're thinking about humans, prehistoric humans, which is the vast majority of the time that humans have been a species was before recorded history. Not even getting into like predecessor species. They're like, every day you didn't know what you were eating, and a significant amount of what you were doing was focused on like making sure that there was food and water and shelter. And that it's quite unlikely that anybody was sitting around with that being like, this is a real bummer that we have to do this. Like, I can't believe I have to go looking for food, because that's just how it is, right? It's only when you get used to a life where there's food at the grocery store that you can pick up whenever or whatever.
That's so interesting.
That you're then, when it happens, you're like, I hate this.
To imagine some guy being like, yes, this is what I do, versus, oh, I have to do this.
Yeah, I do like to think about that, and I like to think about a particular corollary, which is, what are the things that we are used to doing that, like, in the future, people will be like, I can't believe that people used to have to do that. Like, I would hate it if I had to do that. Right? Go ahead.
Well, let's read this and then I'll...
I hate when horror movies do the whole, I'm going to put you through horrific trauma because it will reveal who you really are, as if how people react under trauma defines all of what they are as people. Yeah, that... I agree. I agree with that specific version of it, but I also agree in the broader sense of any concept that people have of like who you really are, the true me, the real me, like that's just as much a narrative as anything else. Like I specifically say this phrase this way to clients sometimes, of like, I'm going to paraphrase the Beatles very badly here. There's nothing you can do that you can't do. There's nothing you can say that you can't say. That people will be like, I should be more real. Like, I don't like being fake. As though because you were saying that thing, that's somehow not you. That's you. That's different than you would be in a different context, or maybe a higher effort version is taking more conscious thought to make it so that that's what you do. But there's reasons that you're responding that way. That is how you respond. You think in response to that set of context, The idea that there's a true self is absurd.
I agree. I was going to mention that I follow this, I don't remember his name, YouTube channel guy who reviews like kitchen supplies, kitchen appliances, and he had designed kitchen appliances for years, but a lot of them are just like products we really don't need. Like they're trying to make like fill a banana up with jelly, like really bizarre things. And it's kind of what you're talking about, of like trying to solve problems that might not.
Well,
I don't know.
So to me, here's part of the issue of what people are struggling with in a general sense, like our clients that we work with, people generally in our culture. We've talked about it in a lot of different ways. This idea of need or justification, right? Like, do we need a device that fills a banana with jelly? No, in the sense that like, would we die without it? But by that same reckoning, we don't need indoor plumbing either. Right? Inventing something that just creates something enjoyable for someone doesn't make it worthless. And this is important, especially for artists, to understand that even though what you do is not necessarily directly related to a person's ability to biologically survive, although you could make your arguments, but the fact that people make arguments is the point that I'm making here. Why do you need to why does it need to be justified that like, no, this can save lives? I mean, I don't disagree with that statement. But why can't it just be like, no, some people like their banana filled with jelly. I don't know. That's fine.
Right.
Not to say that you were opposed to that.
Sure.
this concept of necessity. No, what humans do, what we have always done, is try to make things better, meaning a way that we would more prefer be our experience than they are. All our resources go to making sure that we maintain the base level of what we are currently experiencing. Any resources left over after that go towards how do we increase this base level and make it even more preferable or enjoyable or pleasant.
Yeah. Now I'm picturing I saw a video of a stretcher, but it's like a robot lifting it. So paramedics don't have to use their backs to lift up people. It's just a robot that like walks around. And I was like, all right. I don't know.
Yeah, that what I was saying before about like what are the things that we don't question that later people will. Like I do actually think, as opposed to humans in other contexts and in the past and what, that we all individually have more experiences of this over the course of our lives. Like I can make big examples. This idea of like, this didn't used to bother me, but now it would. So the obvious stuff that people will talk about all the time is like the internet and smartphones in particular, the things that like the idea of like, you used to just have to call your friend, and if they didn't answer, you didn't know if they were home or whatever, you know, like even if all you had to say was just a quick reminder, you just had to call somebody, or you got a pager, and none of us had problems with that or questioned that. And now it would be like, oh my gosh, now on my phone, this is so annoying, you know. But I also mean in each individual specific person's life, this isn't a universally true thing, but like there are jobs that I used to do that I just did that job. And like, even though there were times that I was like, oh, well, this sucks, or I wish it was different than that. That right now, if my life were to change in such a way that I had to go work at Blockbuster, I'd be like, this is unacceptable. Like, if I needed to do it, I would do it. But as compared to doing what I do now and having the control and the autonomy and the joy that I have, like, yeah. Same with, you know, you don't have a kid, and that's fine. You know, that doesn't mean that you might not want one, but like, and then you have a kid, and now it's like, well, if I didn't have this kid anymore, that would be pretty devastating. Humans are very adaptable.
Yeah. I was babysitting like an overnight shift the other day, and there's some really lovely things about it and some really annoying things about it. But it was interesting to see like, oh no, I can do this if I need to. Like if a kid wakes up at 10:30 and is crying, like I will push myself to wake up and sit down with him on the kitchen floor and comfort him. I will wake up and make sure this person goes to school and I make them breakfast. I don't have to do that every day, but I can do it. Yeah. And I have felt anxiety before when I'm like laying in bed, living alone as a single person. Like, am I ever going to be able to do this as a mom one day? And
yeah, actually, it's somewhat related to what you and I were talking about earlier, but to put it in context for everybody, that so much of the distress that people experience, the psychological and emotional unpleasant experiences that people are having that they're coming into therapy, so much of it is related to these ideas that people should be behaving as though their life is different than it actually is. Meaning like, in terms of what you're talking about, we'll talk about parenting, right? That a person who does not have a child that they're parenting might think, well, I wouldn't want to get up in the middle of the night and I don't want to do this. And, you know, you could have that distress about like, does that mean I'm not going to be well suited to doing that thing, or that I would be unwilling to do that thing? But no, it would be pretty absurd for a person to like act as though they have a child when they don't actually have a child.
Yeah.
And that one's a kind of a more obvious example to use, but much more common ones are things like, I really should be focused on making money right now instead of trying to pursue my dream career. Like, there are times in which that is true, right? Like it's never a clearly identifiable binary, it is or it isn't. But there are cases in which like, no, I am not paying my bills. This is unsustainable. Things are going bad and are going to go worse, or things are quickly going to go bad if I don't make some money in the next week. And then there are other cases where it's like, no, we make collectively as partners or as a group, or I as an individual have access to more money than I am spending. I could do this indefinitely without there being like, problems from my inability to pay for things. But when that's the case, you still are like, well, but I would like to make more money. You go up to anybody and like, would you prefer to have more money than you currently do? No one's ever be like, no, I would not. Unless they've constructed narratives about what that might mean, in which case they're still not talking about they wouldn't like to have more money. They're just saying, I think there are other costs associated with having more money and I don't want those. It's not worth it.
Mhm.
More money, more problems kind of thing. Yeah, this idea that like in executive functioning work especially, it comes up pretty much every single time, especially early on, that a lot of what people are struggling with in terms of executive functioning is they're saying, I am failing to do this thing in the way that I need to do it. When in reality, the way they're doing that thing works perfectly fine for the context that they are in. But they're thinking about how everybody does it, this concept of how everyone does it, or how people should do it. And those things are often accurate in terms of like how most people, if they don't do it this way, it's going to cause problems. So to use a specific example, and it might sound trivial, but it is a very common thing that people will talk about in executive functioning is laundry. That people will say like, I need to be doing my laundry more often. And they'll say, okay, well, what is the issue that is being caused by the frequency with which you are doing laundry now, right? Like, are you running out of clean clothes to wear? Are you causing some kind of like obstruction mess in your space that like is inhibiting your ability or other people that you live with's ability to do things? No, but I just, my pile gets really big before I do laundry. Well, if you have enough clothes that your pile can get really big before you need to do it, then that's doable. If you only had 3 outfits, then you probably would do it much more frequently. And so people will have this idea that there's a right way to do things independent of context. Probably the most common version is I need to get my work done earlier. Whether that's I should come home from school and do my homework right away at 4:00, or I always wait till the last minute to do these projects. I'm always running up against deadlines. I should have done it earlier. Why? Well, because then I wouldn't be stressed about it. I would be done and I would never have to stress about it. When in reality, for the most part, when people start it earlier, they don't stop stressing about it. They just work on it for a longer period of time. So it actually makes sense to start it late. But I've had people say things like, I'm so impulsive. And when I say, what's an example of you being impulsive? They say, well, I've been thinking about doing this thing for 6 months. Like that's the opposite of impulsive, but they think that the thing they're thinking about doing is something they shouldn't do, obviously, or they would have done it probably over the course of 6 months. And they're referring to themselves as impulsive for thinking about doing it. Or people who say, I miss deadlines, are a very common version of this for adults. I am failing at work. I'm falling behind. I'm not doing all the things I need to be doing at work. Okay, this has been communicated to you? No, but I'm not getting everything to everybody at the time that they would want it. Has anybody said anything about like, you didn't get this to me by this time and that caused a problem? Has anybody said anything like, you are not doing a good job? No, but I'm not doing everything I'm supposed to do. Okay, right? That like people will sit there and say, I keep missing deadlines. And when you say, like, what? They don't actually ever miss deadlines. They just mean they set their own deadline, or I should start working on this at a certain time, and I missed that.
That's me with studying right now. Oh my God.
We respond to the context. And if we think we should respond as though the context is different than it actually is, then all we're going to do is judge ourselves. And that will never stop. It doesn't matter. If you think, for example, I'm just stressed because I'm not getting enough stuff done, as many people do, the thought would be, well, if I get more stuff done, then I won't be stressed about not getting stuff done. But you get more stuff done and you still are saying, I should be getting more done. Because whatever you accomplish isn't enough. It doesn't change based on how much you accomplish. If you're embarrassed because you don't make enough money, making more money doesn't all of a sudden make you less embarrassed. The target shifts if that's the way you're approaching things. So being able to look at the context and talk about things in observable terms, not just theoretical and abstract terms, helps.
Yeah. As much as I want to shake you when you're doing it, it does help.
Yeah, well, there's just no other way to go about it, right? Like, you can judge yourself for not behaving in the way that would make sense for you to behave if you had a newborn child. But it doesn't make sense for you to behave that way when you don't have a newborn child. So
Right.
you can say you should, but you're just saying you should if well, if you had a newborn child and then you weren't doing these things, then that would be a problem.
Right.
But it's not a problem right now. And it's just people trying to enter. Super common thing that I hate and really try to get people to stop doing this thing is, oh, I've been on break or I've been on vacation, so I've been staying up late and sleeping in, and I got to go back to school in 2 weeks. So I should start going to bed earlier and waking up earlier so I get back on my schedule. This is such a common thing that nobody, when I'm saying that, is questioning it immediately as like, that's an absurd thing to do. But in a moment, hopefully you will think that's an absurd thing to do. Because what is the idea here is that if I can, if the context of my life allows me to do it without it being a problem, I would prefer to sleep the way I'm sleeping right now.
Mm-hmm.
Which, if I prefer something, safest assumption is that there is something about that that is beneficial to me, even if I am not aware of it consciously. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, why would I prefer it? It's not always the case, but you should start with that assumption unless you have some reason to believe otherwise. So, in other words, this is my preferred way of sleeping, probably my best way of sleeping for some reason. I just don't usually have the option to do it because I have to be up at a certain time. And I don't currently need to be up at that time, but in 2 weeks from now, I will need to be up at that time. So I should start acting now as though I don't have access to this option, even though I still do for 2 more weeks, which is absurd.
Mm-hmm.
And people will say, yeah, well, it's to get used to it. Okay, well, presumably in a lot of these cases, right? That's the schedule you were sleeping for several months while you were in school. Did you get used to it? Sure. Did that mean that as soon as you had the option, you didn't revert back to doing it this other way? No, you did. So even getting used to it doesn't mean that it's your preference. It just means, I don't know what. You think it's easier or more routine, more of a habit, and that can be the case. But if it takes a couple of weeks to build it into a habit, why would you start 2 weeks before you have to do it?
Right.
Why not wait until you have to do it, and then you have to do it anyway, and it still becomes easier as it builds into a habit?
People do that a lot for jet lag, right?
That's a different thing.
That's different?
Yeah.
Okay.
But I get what you're saying.
Okay.
Because that one is, I'm going to a place where I do need to be, or it would be beneficial or valuable for me to be awake at these times and asleep at these times. And I have a couple days to get used to it here before being there. And when I'm there, I don't want to spend my first couple days getting used to it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
There's an actual reason there. And there can be sometimes too, right? The reason people will usually give is yeah, but once I'm there and starting, once I'm back at school, to use this example, things are harder. There's more on my plate. And so I'd rather take these 2 weeks leading up to it to go through the difficult process of adjusting my schedule, which makes sense in theory. It's not an inaccurate reasoning. And it's going to be a lot harder to get yourself to sleep on that schedule without there being an actual reason to do it.
Right.
And what often then happens is people struggle with it, and then they're like, oh no, I'm going to struggle with it when I'm there too. And you just spend that 2 weeks still kind of more or less sleeping the way you've been sleeping, but getting really stressed about it.
Mm-hmm.
Same thing as I should have started this 2 weeks ago, this project 2 weeks ago. And I'm starting it the night before. Well, did you get it done on time? Yeah, but I was up till 3 a.m. for you. Did you get it done and turned in? Yeah. What grade did you get? I got an A. So why should you have started it earlier? Because I would have been less stressed. But why would you have started it earlier? Because you would be stressed about not having started it already. The only reason to start it earlier is because you think it is bad to wait longer.
Mm-hmm.
There's no demonstrable reason. You're getting it done. You're getting the grade you want.
You were studying again.
Mm-hmm. As a general rule, and everybody knows this too, if you observe the larger a group of people you observe and over the longer period of time, and the more data you get, any pattern that emerges, you can safely assume is the optimal way of going about things. It is, obviously, there are all kinds of times where the context or something unique to a specific individual has us doing things in a way that is suboptimal generally or whatever. But if we're looking at 1 million people and they all have different backgrounds and whatever, and they're all doing this thing in this way, then we can safely assume that, like, in general, that is the way that is best for people to do it. Like it or not, it is. And in general, people wait till the last minute to do homework. There's a reason for that.
I'm just thinking about how all my classmates are like, the NCE, National Counselor's Exam, is the thing that's been taking up 90% of my brain, and like whatever. I'm like, it has not been taking up any percent of my brain right now.
And which of those is more helpful? Take away the idea of it, the narrative, you say, and just look at it logically. If you have a big test coming up, and in the weeks or months leading up to that test, a massive amount of your resources are dedicated to just thinking about and worrying about that upcoming test, which means those resources are not available for all the other things going on in your life that you would otherwise be addressing, including even just, fun and relaxing things, right? Then after a few weeks or months of that, are you going to end up in a space where you are more suited to take a difficult test than if you had spent those weeks or months spending those resources on the other stuff in your life, including relaxing? Would you rather go into a big test after a week of not sleeping or a week of sleeping really well?
Right. And I am feeling these like guilty for not doing what they're doing. And when I ask what they're doing, I'm like, it just sounds absurd to me what they're doing. And
so much of what back where we were starting, right? So much of what is causing people problems is that they have narratives and understandings that make sense as long as you look at just that particular part of it and don't look at other pieces. And so they're acting as though that is true without looking at all the other stuff that would be like, no, actually this is not. It's kind of that old joke of, how does it go? It's like 4 blind men encountering an elephant.
Go on.
And one of them is touching the leg and saying, what is this? Is this some kind of tree? It's like round and like tough. And one of them is touching the tail and is saying, like, no, this is a paintbrush. And one of them is touching the trunk and says, no, this is a snake, right? The idea here being that elements of a thing can be very similar or even exactly the same as some other thing without the whole thing together being in any way similar. So, in other words, I can see why people would say, if I don't stress out about this test, then I won't study and prepare for it, and then I will be poorly prepared and I will perform poorly. That makes sense as long as you don't look at anything other than just that element of, it is often true that when I am stressed about things, I am also actively working on those things. It is understandable for people then to make the connection that being stressed about something causes me to work on something, which is not true.
I want to see what this.
I think it's hard to dismiss the benefits of starting early, though. I understand there's a higher cost to convince yourself to work on it, but there's also a high cost to waiting. It is not that there's never benefit to starting early. There is often benefit to starting early. It is that based on the kind of thing we're talking about, like, let's start small. Select any given task that a given person has to accomplish by a given time before it becomes a problem. Like that's the useful way to talk about a deadline is there is a time at which if this task is not accomplished, a problem will occur or some problem will start to rapidly worsen after that time. That's what the deadline is. So let's say there's a specific given task for a specific person to accomplish in the specific context of their life, a specific deadline. Sometimes that task is going to be something like, yes, you should start right away on it. Other times it's, no, you should do it at the last possible minute. It is actually not only acceptable, it is beneficial and valuable to do it at the last minute. You can't do it early, and trying to do it early defeats the purpose. So it's not to say that there's never benefit. What I'm saying is, if you notice that there's a particular type of thing or there's a pattern where most people, most of the time, wait until the last minute, then this is probably a task where waiting till the last minute is actually optimal. Whereas tasks that most people do early most of the time is probably one of those tasks that is best to do early.
I don't know. I'm still confused about studying though, because it seems like everyone's studying for months and months and stressing the heck out while they're doing it.
Let me, right now, I'm just going to talk about a stereotype.
Okay, please.
And I'm going to have you and everybody listening, like, imagine this stereotype as I am describing it, right?
Okay.
The person who does not prepare for the test in advance crams like the night before or the hour before and then passes the test really well.
Okay.
Picture that person. What is true of that person? What do you think of that person?
That they need to study that much anyways, that they are smart already, that they knew the stuff.
Yeah, that's typically what the stereotype is there. It's like, oh, well, sure, but that person's just really intelligent. Which is always funny to me that we say, well, the people who are most intelligent do the thing in the least efficient or effective or, the worst way to do it. It's all the people who are unintelligent that are doing it in the best way. And obviously this is all, it's not actually about intelligence, but I'm pointing out the absurdity. Okay, sure, if the test is very simple and you know all the variables and nothing will pop up that will mess with you, I can see the benefit of waiting to the last minute. So I want to be actionable here and talking about I can categorically define, here are some variables that would identify that this is a thing that's better to do early, this is a thing that's better to do late. Not okay to do late, but actually better to do late than early. Like if I wait to do dishes until right before friends are visiting, it's better because I'm more motivated to do the dishes and it uses fewer resources. Again, agreed, and I understand what you're saying. I'm going to offer some different language to some of this because that's actually, how do I say this? What your comments are speaking to right now is the cost associated with what often in executive functioning terms is called initiation. How easy is it to make yourself start doing the thing, or how difficult is it to make yourself start doing the thing? And that's obviously very, very associated with, like, especially the kinds of things we're talking about, homework and things, like it'd be hard to get myself to start it early, but I kind of automatically start it later without having to be like, make yourself do it. I'm going to try not to get too existential into the whole, like, are we really making ourselves do anything at any point? But,
I only do my dishes before people come over.
But aside from the cost of, like, the cognitive resources I am spending in order to get myself to initiate on the task, if we take that away, doing the dishes is actually a task where waiting until the last minute is more problematic because there is something happening in the meantime, meaning if you do the dishes after one day versus after 2 weeks, in the intervening time, there is stuff growing in there and there are odors and the task becomes more difficult to do as time passes. Now, that's not to say that, like, everyone should do dishes all the time, but I will say that unlike homework, doing dishes and or cleaning the kitchen or cleaning up or whatever is a task that different people in different contexts, but broadly, there are many, many people who do the dishes every day. There aren't very many people who start all these homework projects super early. There are reasons that you wouldn't do it, even though doing dishes every day is optimal. This is one of those ones that, yes, doing dishes is actually, do it as early as possible is optimal. Not quite as early as possible. Well, maybe, it depends. But like all tasks, it has a cost associated with it, and you can't always pay that cost, or it's not always, even though the highest value is to wash every dish as you do it, the cost of waiting until the end of the day to do dishes is minimal, and the resources that are freed up by that are significant from not doing 18 dishes 18 times throughout the day. In life hacking, this is often referred to as batching, but it's the same premise as like assembly lines kind of thing, that it's much more efficient to do, if there's a task you have to do like a bunch of it, it's much more efficient to do that all together, clean 30 dishes at the same time instead of clean one dish 30 different times, because there's setup cost and transition cost. Anyway, backing up to the comment before that, benefit of waiting to the last minute. You are speaking to a real thing here, absolutely. But the problem there is people inaccurately identifying what the last minute is. If I think I can start this task 3 hours before it needs to be, before the deadline, right? And then it shows that that time comes, I start it, and as I'm doing it, it's like, uh-oh, I was wrong. I actually need 5 hours. Yeah, that's a problem because missing the deadline is a problem. But what that means is that the actual last minute in that case was starting 5 hours before it was due, not 3 hours. The mistake there is in incorrectly identifying when the last minute was.
Mhm.
And I definitely agree, especially depending on the task and on the context, that part of wanting to start earlier is to say, I am not confident in my ability to predict what all things will happen during this window. And so I need to start earlier than I would otherwise need to because things could come up and problems could occur. And I'm trying to build in a window to be able to, yeah, that's a good thing to do. I just mean if I have friends coming over in like 2 hours and I have dishes in the sink, I could do them now or in 1 hour and 50 minutes. Oh yeah, that makes sense.
Remember when I said move the tissue box?
Sure.
This is what I was thinking of.
Well, you could move in that. Last minute.
Very last minute. There's a tissue box blocking the bottom of where the comments come in, and I predicted at the beginning that this is going to happen.
Well,
But I'm still not moving the box.
we'll see.
We'll see.
It has not yet blocked it.
It has
It's
not
just gotten
yet.
closer to it.
Yeah.
Maybe things will shift up.
Who knows?
This is actually one of the reasons that it is better to wait for something than to do it right away. So I'm going to look at some categorical things here,
Yeah.
but you have to evaluate each individual thing on its own merits. One of the things that, there you go, now it's blocked by the cleaning. One of the things that would indicate that something is actually better to wait until the last minute to do is something that you don't want to do. Because if for no other reason, I'll be real extreme here, if for no other reason, you could die at any point, right? So let's say this thing is due in 2 weeks. If I theoretically start working on it right away, get it done, and then I die, would I theoretically be like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. It turns out I didn't need to do that. Not relevant to turn that in. Wish I had spent those last 3 days on other things that I would have preferred.
Because you're dead.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's not to say, obviously, that I'm thinking we can, oh yeah.
We can see you
Or I
comment
could sit
now.
on the couch on my phone stressing about how I haven't done the dishes for 1 hour and 50 minutes. Yeah,
Been there.
we get the stress, I hope. I really want to like focus on trying to get through this whole framework here.
Yeah.
Stress is a big part of it, the role that it plays and everything. I'm not saying like, oh, well, you might regret this if you die. I'm saying it makes sense that we behave in such a way that this task isn't actually integral to anything that is happening right now.
Yeah.
It is not directly relevant to anything happening right now.
Yeah.
It does not become relevant until the deadline approaches, until the deadline is here. And we want to do it before the deadline is here. But there isn't actually any reason inherently to do, again, depending on the task, but right now, I'm mostly, if I don't specify this, I'm referencing writing assignments, like papers that you're given 3 weeks of notice to work on writing. That's a thing where there is no inherent value to starting it early. As long as it is done by the deadline, there's no difference.
I have something written due on Thursday and I have not started it. I'm like, don't need to.
One very common thing that happens is that I am stressed until I get it done. Well, now there is a reason to do it early because if I do it early, my stress will go away, theoretically. This is part of the problem with, we think about it this way, but it's not actually accurate. But this is the thing people believe, understandably, very reasonable thing of, I am stressed about the fact that I have not done this thing. And part of what I am stressed about, in fact, most of the time, all of what I'm stressed about is the idea that had I already done this, I would not have to be stressed. In other words, the stress is literally just me saying, it would have been better for me to have done this already. Where if I believe that it's actually better to wait, then I'm not stressed. The stress is not inherent. That doesn't mean it's not common. It is very, very common. And theoretically, doing it early would help address that stress. Except, isn't it interesting that everybody who talks about being stressed that they haven't started something earlier is a person who didn't start it earlier. Nobody ever completed a thing and then said, I am stressed about the fact that I haven't gotten this done, right? Like, I know, absurd that I'm saying this. That's self-explanatory. That's the whole point of what people are thinking is, Yeah, if I had done it already, I wouldn't be stressed about it. But it is worth noting that only people who have not done the thing can be stressed about having not done the thing.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can look at, and again, context, but you can look at how frequently does it turn out that there is no other problem, that by the deadline it's still done and still done to the extent that it needed to be done in order for you to get the outcome you're looking for. Right now we're talking about homework, so you still get the A, right? In that case, the logical thing would be to look back and say, well, all that stress you were experiencing, all that time where you were saying you should have started it earlier was inaccurate.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't actually matter that you didn't start it earlier.
Yeah, and it's funny because I'll finish something and I'll be like, wonder how much better this would have been if I started it earlier. Like how many more things I could have
That's the
found.
problem.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
That is the problem with writing assignments in particular. It applies to a lot of things, but this is one of the other categories of thing. Does it have clear completion criteria?
Mm-hmm.
Is it a task that you will know when it is done? So, for instance, doing the dishes is a task that has clear completion criteria. Once there are no dishes left in the sink, every dish has been cleaned and dried and put away, the task is done. There is no option for me to be like, well, I need to iterate on this a little more because there's no more dishes, it's done.
Mm-hmm.
Some tasks, especially assignments, both work and academic, and especially that involve writing or communicating of any kind. Some tasks, the only completion criteria is the deadline.
Mm-hmm.
How do you know that you are done with your paper before the deadline is hit? Let's say you start it 2 weeks in advance. You write a full paper, you write it, it's all done after a day. Do you then say, that is done? I no longer have to think about it, look at it, work on it?
Only if I've got other stuff I also have to do and I know I won't be able to go back on this. But usually,
in which case you are spending the exact same amount of time on it, theoretically, as you would if you had done that at the end. Because again, right, if the idea is if I started it earlier, then I would be done, and that means not looking at it anymore,
mm-hmm.
not working on it, trying to improve it and make it any better. Because if I'm doing any of that, it means I'm spending more resources on this total than I otherwise would have. That's a different thing. But if it is this thing where I could be done with it and I no longer stress about it or think about it, it's just done, then I'm spending the exact same amount of resources on it at the beginning or at the end. So again, other than me feeling stressed about the fact that I should have done it earlier, what is the benefit to doing it earlier? If you're spending the same resources on it, the outcome's going to be the same. The only reason it would theoretically be better if you started it earlier is if you were able to then spend more time and energy and other resources on it. And again, there are certainly times where we get something done at the deadline and we get the D and we're like, okay, I should have started earlier because I would have been able to. But that goes back to, that is a miscalculation of what is the last minute.
Sure.
We're talking about if you get it in and it's the A, then what is the reason to have started earlier? You don't need to have spent more resources on it. You've got the A.
Yeah.
And with writing assignments in particular, they never have clear completion criteria to people who are smart and good at school, to people who think of themselves that way or who are thought of in that way, or feel that kind of pressure. Because the completion criteria for a paper is it must be X number of pages or X number of words. Mm-hmm. It must use this font and that type. You must have this many resources. You must make a bibliography. Like that's the completion criteria.
I have a paper right now. It's just 1 page of just summarize what you read, mention something that was difficult for you, something that really intrigued you, and a resource that you enjoyed. And then she circles if you did those things.
So technically, and here's part of the reason that it goes this way. Technically, you could write something that is riddled with grammatical mistakes and spelling mistakes and all other kinds of things, but as long as it was a page long and each of those things was mentioned, you completed the assignment.
Yep.
Now, sometimes teachers and professors actually do that, where they don't care. If they care about spelling and grammar and all that stuff, they say that they care about it. But if they don't, they don't correct it or mark points on it. Sometimes, though, they sneaky do. They don't say anything about caring about grammar, but then when you turn in the paper, it's like, this is a poorly constructed argument. When, what exactly is it about? This is why, in particular, writing assignments come up a lot. That's why I'm using this particular example. Work-wise, presentations
Mhm.
and reports, same kind of thing. Something where it's like, it is not definable to say this is a thing that cannot be improved upon in any way, shape, or form. So in those cases, the actual completion criteria, the way that you know you are done, is the deadline has arrived. If you start working 2 weeks ahead of time, you will finish when the deadline arrives. If you start working the night before, you will finish when the deadline arrives. That is something, again, can't say 100% of the time, but that is something that generally, if that is true, it is a thing that is better to start late. Otherwise, you will pour additional resources into it
Mhm.
inefficiently. Not just because you could have spent those resources elsewhere, although that matters, but also because in a lot of these cases, putting more resources into it makes the final product worse. Editing and editing and editing and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting and rewriting a paper that has been assigned to you. I'm not talking about a personal, like an art project or, talking about something that has been assigned to you, meaning you're only doing it because someone else has asked you to.
Mhm.
And the thing you are trying to accomplish and how successfully you accomplish it is entirely determined by that other person. Theoretically, they're giving you information in advance to help you kind of match whatever it is that they're going to assess later on. But there's varying degrees to which people are successful at that. So one of the benefits of artificial deadlines is an artificial done state. No, actually, that's one of the beliefs that causes people to try to use artificial deadlines, but it doesn't actually work. Remember, I defined deadline at the beginning of this. A deadline is a point in time at which, if the task has not been completed, a problem now occurs, or some problem starts worsening in some way. To the homework version of this, that's to say a point in time after which, if you don't turn it in, you can't turn it in, or a point in time after which that point passes. Each day that goes, you lose 10% or a letter grade, right? Meaning it has to have an actual problem connected to it. And this might not be what you mean by artificial deadlines, so please clarify, but this is what people often mean by it, so I'm going off of this. When people do this artificial deadline, meaning I set myself a deadline that isn't inherently connected, there is no real problem that occurs other than that I will feel bad for having missed it. That's not a real problem. And again, the only reason you set that artificial deadline in the first place is because you already were feeling stressed about getting it done.
This resonates so deeply with me. I've been like trying to decide, okay, on these days I'll read these chapters and study those chapters. I haven't done any of that. I haven't done any of that pretend like, yep, this is how optimally it'll make sense.
Once again, you very, very rarely, I don't know that I have ever heard somebody say, I set artificial deadlines for myself, and that works.
Yeah.
But I hear a lot of people talk about, I try to set deadlines for myself, and then I miss them anyway. And in fact, what is actually happening here, psychologically speaking, is that some people believe that the way they do a thing must be wrong.
Yeah.
And so no matter what way you end up doing it, you will say that it is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
We were using the example before of someone's thinking, I feel like I haven't gotten enough done. I feel guilty or lazy or I'm judging myself. If I just got more done, then I wouldn't feel like this. Well, that person then theoretically, right? The idea here is if I'm feeling bad or guilty or stressed about something, I do more of it, which is true to some extent in some cases. Actually, it's the opposite in many cases, but in some cases it's true. So somebody who's really stressed about getting enough stuff done is likely to do more stuff than somebody who is not stressed about doing stuff, or at least is likely to spend their resources on trying to do stuff, whether they actually accomplish it or not. So they are likely already accomplishing more,
right? Then,
and yet they still feel like they're accomplishing less.
Mm-hmm.
The people who are most concerned about whether other people might be angry at them are the people who do the most to make sure that nobody's ever angry at them, and therefore are the people who, if we were to average things out, have the fewest people angry at them, and yet they are the most concerned about it. That's how fear and stress and anxiety works. The more you feel the thing, the less likely it is for that thing to actually happen. That is the function that they serve. If you are terrified of falling to death from a high place, then you don't go near high places, which takes the chance of you falling from a high place way down. If you are not afraid of it, you are more likely to go in high places, and therefore the chance that it happens is much higher. That's what I mean by, the thing I managed to do more in college was give myself the deadline of scheduling office hours with my professor or TA to talk about my project, So I make as much progress as possible before then to get the benefit of feedback. Ooh, okay, I like that. I'll come back. That's what I mean by an artificial deadline. In my case, I'm trying to do it now by setting times to check in with my supervisor. Okay, yeah, like I said, we might be talking about different things with this phrase because what you did there is a deadline that was optional. It didn't have to be set, but it is a real deadline. Meaning, once you have scheduled a meeting with your professor or TA, in this example, once that point has come, whatever has not been accomplished is now caused a problem. Meaning, if I have written 1 page, I can get feedback on that 1 page. If I've written 2 pages, I can get feedback on the 2 pages. Once that meeting comes, if I didn't write that 2nd page, I now cannot get feedback on that second. That's an actual real thing. So that is an example of when a person is trying to get themselves to do something earlier, start sooner or get things done more quickly. That's an example of a good way to go about trying to get yourself to do that. Sometimes I don't know the specifics of your case, and we can say that every time you did that was a good time to do it. But in theory, we can also say people sometimes do that and do that successfully at a time when it actually wasn't beneficial, that everything would have been fine had they not done it, hypothetically, right? So it's not to say that it is, again, this isn't evidence that it is always better to start earlier. This is just talking about a specific strategy of when you're trying to get yourself to start earlier. And for what it's worth, as a general thing, all the strategies that are going to be successful in getting yourself to start on something earlier or do something earlier than you otherwise would involves other people.
Going to my mom's again this weekend.
Because that creates an actual deadline. You can call it artificial in the sense that it is optional. You put yourself in a position to have that deadline, but now it actually does matter because if I'm studying with my mom is asking me a question. Being able to answer that question is now directly relevant. It's not just something that won't be relevant for another 2 weeks. It's relevant now. In other words, even then we're still not starting it early. We're just creating a different set of problems with a different deadline, and we're still solving that problem at the last minute. But we're creating problems and deadlines that solving those problems by that deadline, we believe will help us in approaching the other one later on. Anyway, I'm going to keep running with the idea of writing a paper because it's just a good example to be able to put some of these. So one of the things is if it is not something that you enjoy doing or want to do, it is more likely to be something that starting at the last minute is optimal. Remember, last minute, what we mean by that is the last point at which you can start, which will result in you accomplishing the task successfully by the deadline. Starting later than that is not last minute, that's past the last minute. I do put work into making sure that I'm getting people to use the term last minute to refer to this instead of just using the phrase as people often do, last minute, to mean like the night before. Some tasks the night before is not enough time to avoid the problem. Some it is. So that's one. If it does not have clear completion criteria other than the deadline itself, meaning you're giving this presentation to the client next Friday, that's when you know it's done. That's when you're giving it. There's no point working on it after that point. It's done. But other than that, how do you know it's as good as it could be? You could always put more effort, more resources into it and potentially improve it. So that's one of the things that makes it better to do later. The more abstract and intellectual the task, this is part of the reason, again, writing assignments, presentations, the better it is to do later. I know that sounds like the opposite for a lot of things. In fact, one of the comments earlier was about if a task is simple and you know how to do it, it's better to wait till the last minute. And it is true that knowing what is involved in doing a task is something that is important because otherwise you cannot determine what the last minute actually is. That, again, related but separate set of problems is being able to determine when is the actual last minute. And if you don't know what all things need to be done to accomplish the task, you cannot determine what the last minute is. I have a specific strategy for that. We'll hopefully come back to that, but I'll put
Can you do it in 15 minutes?
Help me remember, is that with many of these things, we actually want to split this into 2 tasks. One of those tasks is solving the puzzle. The other one is grinding. That's what I like. That's what I call them.
Okay.
Help me remember. We'll get to that. Anyway, let's say I'm assigned to write a paper. The first random paper that popped into my mind is when I had to write a paper about a volcano for like a geology class.
Mhm.
Just pick a volcano and write a 3-page paper for my like geology 101, for non-majors class or whatever. Let's say I'm assigned this paper, it's due in 6 weeks, which is not an uncommon amount of time to be given. Okay, well, let's assume that whether I do it right now, as soon as I'm assigned it, or whether I do it at the last minute, the actual amount of time and resources and whatever required are the same. Like once I begin the task, it takes the same amount of time and energy, and I have to do the same research either way, etc. In that case, if I start it now, I am approaching this task as a person who has not thought about this at all, because I just was presented with it.
Mm-hmm.
If I start this task in 6 weeks, I'm approaching the task as somebody who has put some amount of thought and effort and awareness towards it over 6 weeks. Which person is better equipped to do the task? A person who's never thought about it, or a person who's been thinking about it, even if minimally, for 6 weeks?
The latter.
You are better suited to
Jesus.
do these tasks the more time passes.
So weird.
Because what happens in the meantime, it's sometimes referred to as the shower principle. That what people generally know, or what people generally experience but don't know, and then when you know it and you can explain it, it becomes like a fun party information fact, the shower principle thing. That when you are attacking a problem and you're stuck or you're having a hard time, that stepping away from that problem and doing something else
Mm-hmm.
will often be much more advantageous to you than continuing to try and solve that problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's sometimes called the shower principle or the eureka principle sometimes, because in specific, it often happens with people while they're taking a shower. Because you're in the shower, you
Sure,
can't
yeah.
be working on the problem anymore. But there's also not a lot going on to like occupy your mind. And so the mind works on many different things simultaneously. And the amount of resources, awareness, and attention dedicated to anything is in constant flux, right?
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes it's such a little tiny amount of it. There's some awareness, some resources going there, but such little that it would be difficult for me to like call it out once the moment has passed. Like when I'm walking down a crowded street, in every moment, I am noticing the people in front of me and around me. We can say that that must be true because I am adjusting the way in which I am walking so that I don't walk into people. I must therefore be aware. But the moment I am past that person, I no longer remember that person. So we're taking in the minimal data necessary. I have a term I call attention sinks for this.
Sinks, spell that.
SINKS, like a sink with a drain. That what happens is, cool, so much time has passed that I'm incredibly equipped to do so many things. You're probably joking, but yes, no, that's true. Like there's a reason that we talk about how experience and knowledge helps people to be better suited for tasks. There's a reason we talk about age and wisdom. Mm-hmm. Obviously, when talking specifically about age, there are physical things that happen that might make you worse suited to a particular task, but that's going to come back to solving the puzzle versus grinding. So
don't worry, I haven't forgot.
What was I saying? Oh, attention sinks.
Mm-hmm.
So we all know this, right? Oftentimes we refer to it as being bored or whatever, but like in any given moment, but depending on what's going on, all of my attention could be called to something in front of me, right? Sometimes we refer to that experience as being in the zone. Like I don't even have any spare attention to be aware of my own internal experience. So even though I am behaving in a way that it is not possible for me to have behaved if I wasn't taking in and utilizing data, I have no experience or awareness of thinking about what I am doing. Whereas on the far other side of the spectrum, there are times where nothing is taking my attention or calling my attention except for my own internal experience, and I'm just in my head thinking and not paying attention to anything else, right? But when you also be making more progress each time you shower if you put more work into the problem already?
So I was thinking of it too.
That's a good question. Also in seriousness, some don't have to age to possess wisdom. Witness the difference between you and I. Well, that really depends on what you mean by wisdom, but whatever you mean by it comes with experience, and people get experience in different fields at different rates, right? Like yes, a 20-year-old who has spent 10 years learning how to fix cars knows a lot more and is a lot better at it than a 70-year-old who's never fixed cars. Because time is a barrier, it's a bottleneck, but it's not a guarantee of any particular set of information. Wouldn't you also be making more progress each time you shower if you put more work into the problem already? There is some truth to that. So let me explain the answer to that. In this scenario we're talking about, I'm working on a problem and I am stuck on it. We can all agree, by the very nature of the idea that sometimes it's better to step away, we can all agree that there is a point at which you're hitting diminishing returns, right? Where the more resources you're pouring into it, so the law of diminishing returns is for each unit of a resource spent in pursuit of a task returns less value than the previous unit of that resource spent in pursuit of that task. Meaning the second minute you're working on something, you get less out of it than the first minute. And the third minute you get less than the second minute, and so on. You can divide it up however you like, right? So there's this diminishing returns. And because no human has only one task to focus on, optimal efficiency is that we are shifting from one task to another, right? We're engaging in this. It is very useful to do, but it decreases in efficiency. My return on investment gets lower as I continue to do it. And I have other tasks that I can shift to that and work on that, and I can come back to this later. So what we're saying, gotta maximize shower time. Like if you take 3 showers each with 5% of the information you need to complete the task, you make less progress than if you work on the task and take showers with 5%, 15%, and 25% of the data to process. And then another comment, wisdom, doing what you know how to do, correct application of true principles. Okay, I like both of those comments. So what we can all agree on is that there is theoretically an optimal balancing point where if I had put less resources toward this task before moving on to something else, it would have been a less efficient overall expenditure of my resources in managing all the things I need to manage. And also, if I put any more resources into this because of how little I'm getting out of it at this point, I would be suboptimally managing my resources across everything. So there's an optimal balancing point at which it's like, this is where I've done the best amount, where it's good to stop and do something else instead. That's agreed? Well, if we were to intellectually try to identify at what point that is, that's impossibly complex. Mm-hmm. How could you possibly be aware of all the variables? You'd have to predict the future. It's just not doable. But just like it would be impossible for anybody to calculate the exact amount of water that they need to drink for optimal functioning, we have built in very complex mechanisms that take into account all kinds of data that doesn't involve conscious thinking and then outputs some information to our conscious thinking. In other words, the mechanism that produces the sensation that we call thirst is taking in data about the condition of our skin and how dry and how full or empty our bladder is, and all these different things that we are not consciously aware of. And it calculates all that and then puts out like, this is how thirsty you are, and adjusts it up and down. That is a friggin' miracle that we as humans have that. Mm-hmm. It is absurd for us to try and be like, no, I can intellectually say that regardless of how thirsty I am or am not, I should drink 64 ounces of water in a day. If I am not thirsty, I should still make myself drink that. And if I drink that amount and I'm still really thirsty, I shouldn't drink any more. That's absurd. We all know that, right? Like, useful research, but to say that I would drink the same amount of water is optimal for me to drink in a day where I am hiking through the desert as it is on a day where I am sitting in my house, that's ridiculous. To say that someone who weighs half as much as I weigh optimally drinks the exact same amount is absurd. It's kind of sometimes like, not in any given case with a person, but just the concept that we do this in our culture is really angering to me. That we're like, no, millions, trillions, billions, I guess not trillions, millions and billions of years of evolution has resulted in this like miraculous mechanism that takes real observable data, turns it into like electrical signals that somehow results in just a thing I am aware of, then I don't know. But that's probably not right. I should probably focus on what somebody.
Then I get
Found
guilty
out
for
in
not
a study.
drinking X amount of cups of water.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So, what would the mechanism be for determining when you have spent the optimal amount of time engaged on a task intellectually? We all know that if you study some versus none, you get more information. But if you sit there and study incessantly without taking any breaks, you actually make things worse for yourself if you go too far. We know there's a balancing point.
Mhm.
Can't actually calculate it. What would be the thing that theoretically is doing our best job to take data in, make calculations, and result in just a thing we're aware of, even if we don't know the data that it's built on? Impulse. Yeah, when you are bored of it is probably when it is optimal for you to shift to another task.
Mhm.
When you are curious or interested in it is probably when you are.
Mhm.
And again, everybody knows this, but they get it backwards. Everybody knows that when I am interested in a task, things go better with that task. When I am bored with a task, things go worse.
Mhm.
But we live in a culture where at this point we have solved so many problems that have to do with like pain and discomfort and convenience and whatever, that we are almost exclusively focused on problems that are cognitive in nature, our feelings and the feelings of others and thoughts and predictions, almost exclusively. I shouldn't say almost exclusively, but as far as what we think about and pay attention to.
I want to make sure you get to your puzzling and grinding.
Yeah. So what that means is that we end up thinking that our psychology matters more than anything else. So we reverse the cause and the effect.
Mm.
Instead of thinking of it as, yes, when we are doing optimal work is when these processes would say, good, let's keep doing this. And therefore that's the sensation I have, is being interested in it. And when I am in such a place for whatever reason that I am doing poor work is when my processes then take data and give me the impulse of like, this is boring, let's do something else, which is logically the obvious explanation for what's happening. Instead, we flip it around with this magical story of, no, I can in some way completely independent of any reality, no actual data. In some other way, I can just make myself be interested or make myself be bored. And if I make myself interested, then I do good work. The doing good work is a result of being interested and enjoying it. The doing bad work is a result of not enjoying it, which is absurd. That's like saying, oh, I make myself thirsty so that I then drink water. Like consciously, I decide to be thirsty because that would be a good time for it. No. Consciously, I choose to feel pain because it would be optimal for me to pay attention to and address the painful thing. No, these are sensations that are delivered to us. So yes, there is an optimal balancing point, and having more information is theoretically more beneficial in this shower principle stuff working in the back of your mind than not. And the way to do that is to engage with the task to the extent that you are curious about it, interested in it. Unless there is some reason to do it otherwise, which there oftentimes is, unless there is some reason to consciously get yourself to focus on the task, meaning engage in things that are directly relevant to the task, even when you are not interested in it, the optimal is to do what you're interested in when you're interested in it. That's not a rare thing, it happens all the time, but unless there's reason, default to doing what you want to
I
do.
always feel like such an oddball when I do that. Yeah.
Because of this false correlation that everyone has created, that being stressed is what gets you to do things. That's the idea, not of this version of artificial deadlines, but the one that people generally are talking about, is if I give myself my own deadline, then I'll be very stressed, which will get me to do stuff. Nope. Stress is a physiological thing. There is a psychological experience, a psychological state that we also call stress. But there is also a biological, a physiological experience that we call stress. And the two things correlate very closely, not one-to-one exactly, but very closely. And because it is physiological, it is observable, meaning we can watch what happens to a person's body, including their nervous system. The brain is part of the nervous system. We can see what happens to a person's body when they are experiencing stress. And that state makes you worse at doing anything that involves intellect or cognition.
Mm-hmm.
It makes you better at doing stuff that involves physical activity at the expense of you have to you're paying a greater cost later, meaning again, the extent to which I like it and I'm interested in it, that is based on what is optimally sustainable. If there's reason that it would be better for me to do it, even though it's not like optimal right now, then it results in stress. And we have a mechanism that stress dumps adrenaline into the bloodstream or cortisol or whatever version's happening in a particular moment that makes it so that I'm now doing this thing beyond what would be sustainable because it's important, even though the cost of that is that later on I will be damaged and have to spend additional resources making up for what I'm doing now. It's being stressed is like spending on a credit card. That there are often times, depending on a person's context, there's all kinds of time where it's like, would I like to pay interest on this? No, but spending this money on this thing right now is like the difference between doing that and waiting until later is much worse than the difference between paying this amount versus that amount with interest.
Mm-hmm.
But that's what stress is. It's going into debt. It does not make you better equipped to doing things over the long term. And it does not help you in the moment do anything that involves cognition. The more stressed you are when trying to take a test, the worse you will perform. The more stressed you are when trying to write a paper, the worse you will perform. The more stressed you are when trying to move a big pile of rocks, the better you will perform for a short period of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's the key here. You cannot make yourself do these things. We are observing reality. When our idea of how things should go and our observation of how things are going don't match up, what most people in our culture do is say, well, reality is not behaving like it's supposed to because it's supposed to go this way and I don't change my idea, which is, by definition, insanity, if we want to be real specific. But obviously the better way to go about it is, well, this is how I think things will go. This is how things actually go. Guess I was wrong. Like, I think I should start earlier. I didn't, and I got an A. Guess I was wrong. Not like, well, I don't know how reality went incorrectly that time, but I'm glad it did, but it won't next time.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, solving the puzzle versus grinding.
You want to read the comment first, or you want to?
I'm picturing a TTRPG mechanic where every time you shower or rest, you can roll a die to make progress on the task, and your modifier is higher if you put more time into the task. Yeah, boredom, like sadness and anger and hunger and all these other things, is an unpleasant experience. That doesn't mean it is a symptom of something going wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Unpleasant experiences, we are built to have those things. They are meant to be unpleasant. It serves a function to respond in that way. Boredom is one of those things that what we're talking about is nothing is catching my attention right now, and then I direct it at something else. If what I direct it at is the fact that I'm bored, that can be very unpleasant. But if I directed it making up a story in my mind or thinking about that other thing, Okay. Solving the puzzle and grinding.
You got this.
To solve a problem,
Mm-hmm.
I'm gonna go so fast right now.
You already have been.
I know. I've been trying because I know I got to wrap up, and it's on recording, so people can go back and slow it down and watch it at that rate if that works for them. Start with, here's how I define a problem. Problem is a thing of which I am currently aware that is different than I would want it to be.
Mm-hmm.
So that doesn't mean it has to be in the environment. Some problems for me are just things I'm thinking of. When I think about the fact that someday I will die, I don't like that. That's different than I would like it to be. And the result of a problem is an impulse, a desire, whatever you want to call it, to eliminate it. I have 4 variables to do that. I can become less aware of it or not aware at all.
Mm-hmm.
I can change the material reality of things such that what is happening is now closer to what I would want it to be, including exactly the same. I can change what I want so that what I want is now in alignment with what is happening. Or the secret 4th variable, I can change my perception of the material reality so that even though nothing changed, I think of it as being closer to what I wanted.
Mm-hmm.
If you think about things in that way, everything makes sense. Everything where you're like, why would somebody do that? Well, because decreasing your awareness of a thing is also solving the problem. And sometimes, like in the case of your own mortality, is the only solution to a problem. You cannot change what you want. You cannot change the material conditions of the fact that you're going to die someday. And you can't change your perception to be like, no, I don't think well, actually, that's not true, depending on what you think about an afterlife and stuff. But all these things make sense through that lens. To solve a problem, 2 things must be true. You have to know, there has to be an idea of what set of things could be done, what set of actions could be taken that, if taken, would result in the problem being solved. Solving means diminished or eliminated. 2, that set of actions has to be taken. These are two separate things. I like to refer to them as the first is solving the puzzle, figuring out what is the set of actions that if they were taken, I believe would result in the problem being solved. The other I refer to as grinding. I know what needs to be done. This isn't about generating ideas of how to go about doing it. This is just about taking the set of actions that's been identified. All people all the time are solving problems by grinding, like when you get dressed and when you eat food, like these are problems that you are not having to innovate every time. Like what set of actions needs to be taken? It's already known. You just got to do it. All people at some times are doing things where I am purely solving the puzzle. There is no there's no intention and potentially not even any possibility of taking the set of actions. TTRPGs are a good example of this, or where it's like this isn't even a real thing where a real set of actions could be taken. I'm purely just engaging in the intellectual play of if this was the case, then these are things that if these things were done would result in this change. And there's reasons that that's helpful. Play is very helpful across the board. I'm trying to make progress on the mortality problem, but unfortunately my modifier and damage die are at 0 per shower rest. Yeah, well, depending on how a person is shaped, and I literally mean like myelinated neural pathways, but all kinds of things beyond that. What happens when you're in the shower and bored can be really pleasant or really beneficial or really unpleasant or really problematic. And those things can combine, and like things can be pleasant and problematic or unpleasant and beneficial. But that's why we we shape ourselves such that we respond to that thing later in that way. That's the control we have. You don't actually have control in the moment. You can't be like, I am going to do this thing now, go. That doesn't happen. But you can do things that make it so that in the future, in response to a particular stimuli, you then do it. Including even things like, okay, I can make it so that when I get to 3, I will respond to that stimuli by doing the thing. And then I can make myself say 1, which will make me say 2, which will make me say 3, and then I respond that way. Different effectiveness. What do you mean I don't have a fight death mechanic? We all do. It's just everything. Literally everything you do and that your body does is the fight death mechanic. I think you mean fight the personification of death in order to be like avoid having to, like play chess with death. And I just realized that's probably what it means. Back to solving the problem of grinding. 2 separate tasks. People and different strategies, different environments, different people are better suited to one or the other, and that is domain specific. There are things where I can do the grinding. I'm super well suited to doing the grinding and not the solving the puzzle. There are other things I'm really well suited to solving the puzzle and not the grinding. When it comes to tasks like what we're talking about, where the optimal is to do it at the last minute, remember, means time at which I can start where I will be able to have the resources available to me and able to do the work necessary to result in the thing being done in the way that is successful by the time the deadline hits. In order to do that, I have to solve the puzzle first. Writing the paper is the grinding. Figuring out what it is that I'm going to have to do when I write the paper is solving the puzzle. So that part, yes, I agree, generally should be done as soon as possible. That part does, if you do it, does often, not always, but does often decrease the stress that you will feel. Because some of that stress that you're feeling is like, I'm not even actually totally sure. I know I'm supposed to write a paper, but I don't know how many sources I'm supposed to have, or like I have an idea of what I'm going to write, but I'm not sure if that's exactly right. And so solving the puzzle first, which includes part of what you were talking about, setting up office hour visits, can be that, right? Right away, as soon as you can, and there's other tasks you got to balance, blah, blah, blah. As soon as you can, you sit down and you go over, let me make sure I understand exactly what I need to do, including what resources I need to have available and what I need to do in order to, like, if I'm going to need 6 sources, then I'm going to have a set of tasks in order to make sure I have access to those 6 sources. That's funny.
Usually how I approach papers is like, okay, here's the APA format and the title headings and things, just so I have that outline done, but I don't write anything. I just have the outline of like where I'm going to have to write, if that makes sense.
That is a subset of this. That's some of it. Because some of it is like, super common one is, I'm not exactly sure. Like, I know I'm supposed to write a paper. I know I'm supposed to write a paper about this thing or whatever. But if anyone were to ask me, and nobody does, if anybody were to ask me, like, okay, specifically, actionably, what is the first step? Well, it's in the paper. So in that case, the first step would be you have to go read the assignment paper. And I haven't done that. So I don't actually know. I just know that I'm confident that I know where to go to get that information. There's always that
I
concern
love that you
might be wrong.
mentioned that, but nobody will ask you that.
Until you come and work with me, because that's a very common, especially intelligent, academically successful people, very commonly like, yeah, I know what to write. Oh, what? Like, it's just a paper. Yeah, about what? About like blah blah blah. Okay, but specifically, and it immediately becomes clear, like, no, you don't actually have this set as a discrete set of actionable tasks. Anyway, so that's how I was referring to in this case. We can use that language in other things, but in this case, solve the puzzle as soon as possible, do the grinding as late as possible.
Mhm.
Split those two things up. And most people don't have them split up, so they just do them both at the same time. And that's where things get confused, because yes, if you didn't figure out, like, one of the most common things about starting at the last minute, but it's actually too late, is you start, and then as you're going, you're like, oh, I need to source for this and the library is closed and I can't, like, if you solve the puzzle first, that stuff doesn't happen. Plus, there are things that require different energy and different resources, and you're better suited to at different times. Solving the puzzle is a great thing to do at night by yourself in your house. Grinding generally is not, like, generalizations. All right, I gotta get going, but I'm gonna read this. The only progress I've made in the shower is death is unknowable, and that means death could be a person. And finally, if they're a person, I can fight them. Nobody asks Brandon how to start their papers, or this wouldn't be a problem. I'll just say this really quickly. I forget who it was, some famous writer, sci-fi or philosophy, I can't remember who, that talked about travel to the stars, saying that, like, I look up at the stars and I think about how do we get there, and not, we don't have to rely on this premise that the only means is physical transportation. That's a very limited way of thinking in a certain set of dimensions and whatever. And then I will think sometimes that the way to travel to the stars is the thing that we call death. What we're referring to as death is actually the process of taking the journey up to the stars. And then when I think about it like that, every different way of dying is just a different means of taking transportation to get where we're all going. And that dying of old age is like walking there slowly, and dying in an accident at a young age is like taking the jet. It's just about how quickly you get there. I wish I could remember who said that.
Well, it's okay. It's on a coffee shop wall somewhere.
Probably.
I'm just kidding.
All right, I gotta go.
Okay,
Good to be
thanks,
with you all.
guys.
We'll be back next
Bye.
week. Goodbye.